Howdy. All right, welcome to our dinner evening part of the daytime conference titled the 2024 Taiwanese General Elections and the new next phase of the trilateral relationship between Taiwan, the United States, and China. My name is Yao Yun. Just feel free to call me Yao. I'm a chair and professor of international study and modern languages. I'm also directing the Taiwanese East Asia Studies programs. So that's why I'm hosting tonight's event. And well, you know, we have a distinguished guest coming to give some remarks. So I want to be very brief to invite our Associate Vice Provost of International Relations and Engagement, Dr. Hans Stockton, at the University of Thomas, to give his welcome remark on behalf of the university.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to see you all this evening and to greet you on behalf of our university's president, Dr. Richard Ludwig. To thank the Asia Society for making this venue available and for many years of partnership with the University of St. Thomas. As well, our dear friends, the Director General and other friends from the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office. Today it was yet another wonderful panel, or a series of panel discussions about Taiwan, Taiwan's place in the world, the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. And you are always going to find the absolute top-notch scholars at our Taiwan Studies programs. I really want to thank my colleague, Dr. Ye, who has really taken off as director of the Taiwan Studies program, as well as our Mandarin Center of the UST and Wenzhou University. Again, it's a pleasure. Thank you all so much for your support. Please do come by campus and enjoy our beautiful campus. And yeah, I think that's about it. So thank you very much.
And next, I would like to invite tonight's co-sponsor, the Director General Yvonne Xiao of Taipei Economic Cultural Office in Houston, to give her remark. Thank you.
Honorable Congressman of Green and professors, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Today you have a long day. We have a conference focusing on Taiwan's general election and also the prospects of Taiwan, U.S. and China relations. And tonight, this evening, we have a keynote speech delivered by Professor Jacques deLisle, and it will be focused on TRA 45 and also UNGA Resolution 2758. And this year marks the 45th anniversary of Taiwan Relations Act, which I just called TRA. It's a pivotal piece of legislation and which has shaped the enduring partnership and relations between Taiwan and the U.S. This act passed in 1979, and it reaffirmed Americans' commitment to maintain a sturdy relations with Taiwan in the face of complex international dynamics. And for nearly half of a century, the TRA has served as a solid foundation of our relation and also a cornerstone of peace and stability in the region of Indo-Pacific. It has provided it's fine, yeah. And it has provided the framework of vibrant economic, culture, and security ties that bind our two nations together. And it also enabled the U.S. to support Taiwan's growth. And as you can see, Taiwan now has emerged as the 21st biggest economy in the world. And Taiwan has been the global high-tech powerhouse. And Taiwan also became the beacon of democracy, human rights, and freedom. Much has happened during the past 45 years, and I expect the next 45 years will even be more exciting. And as we celebrate this milestone, we must also confront the China's malign influence and the malicious distortion especially regarding the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 2758. The resolution only addresses China's representation to the United Nations. It has nothing to do about Taiwan. However, China has been deliberately misinterpreting it and take it as endorsing its One China principle, and it uses it as to falsely claim sovereignty over Taiwan, to suppress Taiwan's international participation, also to prevent Taiwan from making contribution to the international society. Such vicious distortion should be rejected and also to be corrected. And Taiwan's rightful place in the international arena should be affirmed. We appreciate that the United States and other like-minded countries have been showing your support about Taiwan's international participation. They know that Taiwan can help, and Taiwan can contribute to addressing global challenges. And in fact, in many cases, Taiwan, we're already doing it. And as we reflect on the 45th anniversary of TRA, let us recommit to strengthen our bilateral relations, and let us work together to ensure Taiwan's voice is heard in the international stage, and also to ensure that Taiwan's contribution to the international community are accepted, are acknowledged, and are valued. Taiwan is an indispensable partner to the world, and Taiwan should be part of the major international organizations. And I thank you all for being here tonight to learn about TRA and to learn about the China's malign distortion of the UNGA Resolution 2758. And I believe the keynote speech, Jacques deLisle, will bring us a lot of good discussion. Let me thank you again for being here with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know the applause was for dinner, but I'll take it anyway. Thank you, y'all, for your very kind and warm introduction. Friends, it is a singular honor to be with you, and because I'm an interloper, I understand that my words must be terse and I have to be laconic, but I have to acknowledge certain people. I almost said something that I'm supposed diplomatically not to say. So Consul General, Director General, it's an honor to be here. Thank you for the invite. I appreciate it very much. I'm seated next to my very dear friend, the Honorable Chase Untermeyer, who has served in one way or another 4 presidents, Reagan, Bush 1, Bush 2, and Clinton for a very short stint. I'm honored to know that the University of St. Thomas is still doing great things. It is a beautiful campus, and I've enjoyed being there on many occasions. I believe there's a representative here from the office of Senator Huffman. So would you give her an expression for me, please, if you would? Thank you. We who hold public trust try to look out for each other. If I've missed any members of the diplomatic corps or any other persons who are associated with the political order, my apologies to you. But friends, I'm here just to say a couple of things. I have 4 events all starting at the same time. But I'm here to say just a couple of things. The first is I have enjoyed the relationship with the community from Taiwan here in Houston, Texas. It has been a very beneficial relationship for the city of Houston. The people have been very productive and they've done great things. But more importantly, I have tried to do as best as I can to help us maintain a very positive and strong relationship with Taiwan. It is very important for this relationship with the economy that Taiwan has, and it's always growing, and with our economy, that we maintain a strong relationship. We have seen how that relationship can be of great benefit to us. I want to make sure that we continue the relationship. And as long as I'm a member of the Congress of the United States of America, I will stand with Taiwan. I will not be one of those persons who would want to see something untoward occur as it relates to Taiwan. And if I may say so, strategic ambiguity is quite ambiguous, but I think this president has made some statements to give a degree of clarity to it. He has not made it perspicuously clear, but I think he's given us hints as to where he will stand when Taiwan is in need of the hand of the United States of America. God bless you. Good to be with you, and I hope that things will go well for the rest of your evening. Thank you very much.
So, our keynote speaker is Dr. Jacques deLisle. He's going to talk about the 45th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act and the meaning of the UN Resolution 2758. Hopefully, meaning. So, a little bit background of Dr. Jacques deLisle. Dr. Jacques deLisle is a Stephen A. Cozen Professor of Law, Professor of Political Science, and Director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China and the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and Chair of the Asia Programs at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. So, he's writing on Taiwan's international status and cross-strait relations, China's engagement with international law, and the role of law in China and U.S.-China relations have appeared in OPIS, the Journal of Contemporary China, Asia Policy, the China Review, the Administrative Law Review, and many law reviews, foreign affairs, and area study journals and edited volumes. Too many, though. I'm not so sure how far I can keep reading. He also hosts a number of positions in the think tank organization, and to summarize it, because there's another page to read, so I don't think I want to bother you with that. To summarize Dr. Jacques deLisle's accomplishments in the past, basically, when you talk about law, China, international relations, cross-strait relations, if you Google these four terms together, I bet you Dr. Jacques deLisle will be on the first two. That speaks his accomplishment. So, please join me to have a big round of applause to welcome Jacques deLisle onto the stage to give his remarks. Thank you. A little bit repetitive, so let me skip it.
I love doing dinner theater. Well, thank you all for coming. Director General Xiao, Professor Ye, Vice Provost Stockton, and Yao and Hans I've known forever, but it's great to be able to address them by title. And my thanks to the Asia Society for hosting this and for TICO for making it possible. It's great to be here. So I've been given, as you heard, two big topics to cover, and I'll try to do it. Actually, you know what? I'm going to get my stopwatch so I can keep track of time here. We're at the 45th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act. So Taiwan's Relations Act is officially approaching middle age, but it's a quite vibrant middle-aged character. I come to praise it, not to bury it. And then I'll turn to 2758, which is a bit older and a bit more problematic. So the Taiwan Relations Act has been an enduring, multifaceted, and partly accidental genius for underpinning U.S. policy toward Taiwan and cross-strait issues. And we're now in an era, of course, of much more fraught and rivalrous relations between the U.S. and China, heightened concerns about China's coercion of Taiwan, and in that context, it's become too easy to understate how much the TRA has contributed and continues to contribute. No problem? Am I too far away? Okay. You're too tall. I'm too tall, all right. I'll work on that. So in that context, it's easy to underappreciate the TRA. It was adopted, of course, in a moment of great peril for Taiwan when the US switched its diplomatic relations from the ROC to the PRC. And it has been a pillar of US policies that's been crucial to maintaining the status quo, avoiding cross-strait conflict, and sustaining Taiwan's autonomy. Substantively, what the legislation did was it created legislatively a second best for what Taiwan had just lost. It lost the Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States, it lost formal diplomatic relations, and instead we have substitutes. The creation of the American Institute in Taiwan with seconded staff from the State Department working in it, and it's been the basis of really robust informal relations. It conferred on Taiwan as a matter of US law the equivalent of the privileges and immunities that foreign states and foreign governments with recognized status and diplomatic relations have. And it maintained commercial, cultural, and other relations. It authorized the continuation, as well as support for Taiwan's participation in the international community, although not in states member-only organizations ultimately. On the Mutual Defense Treaty side, of course, it stated that US policy is to maintain the capacity to resist force or coercion by China that would jeopardize the security of the people on Taiwan, and to provide arms of a defensive character consistent with Taiwan's needs. It also made clear the US policy position that our expectation is that the future of Taiwan will be determined by peaceful means. It also, of course, provided other provisions which we did not pay too much attention to at the time. The idea that any resolution had to be acceptable to the people of Taiwan took on a very different coloration as Taiwan became a consolidated, thriving democracy. You now need genuine consent of the people who live on the island. The expression of the US interest in the human rights of the people in Taiwan was a little bit of a dig back in the authoritarian era, but now it's become another basis of support, and both of those provisions have made Taiwan part of the values focus of US foreign policy. Structurally, the Taiwan Relations Act occupies a special place in the sacred texts of US policy, alongside the 3 communiques and the 6 assurances. In contrast to the 3 communiques, it's more pro-Taiwan in terms of its content. There's lots of stuff in there the PRC would never agree to in a joint communique. And it has the virtue of being a unilateral US act, whereas the communiques are joint undertakings. And it actually winds up blunting China's critique in many ways, because China, of course, can say it has a stake in interpreting the joint declaration, the joint communiques, and China tries to insist the joint communiques are in fact treaty obligations binding on the US. The US view is very different, they're just important policy statements. And by making the TRA a piece of domestic law as it is, the US could actually implicitly play one of China's cards against it. China famously doesn't like other people telling countries how to use their sovereignty at home, and so the TRA, even though China complains it violates international law, is a domestic act by another sovereign. The TRA, thus, I think, is an impressive act of acoustical separation. It is formally merely an act of domestic lawmaking. It takes no position whatsoever on Taiwan's international legal status. It's consistent with being agnostic on the sovereignty question. But it creates and embeds deeply in US law diplomacy and security commitments light, the best we could do post-79. In contrast, the 6 assurances, it's a law and it's a public document, and therefore has a bit more heft to it. These features of the TRA, its uniquely high status and its near half-century of existing almost without amendment, has made it important to stable and credible US policy, including commitments to Taiwan, and both the deterrence and assurance toward China that has been part of US policy, even though China mostly complains about too much deterrence and not enough assurance. When US officials stray too far from the sacred texts and from what's written in the TRA has been extremely useful. You can always scurry back to it saying, these are the sacred texts, TRA first among them, we didn't really change policy. And so it has made it much easier for US officials to walk back missteps or unwise policy. And the TRA thus serves, along with the 3 communiques and the 6 assurances, but more so, as the home base, the safe harbor, when you see problematic moves by officials or things we later think better of. Think of Biden's repeated statements about commitments to Taiwan. They have in some ways changed policy, but the consequences have been mitigated by the ability to say, oh, well, we're still guided by the TRA. Think of the George W. Bush statement that the US would do whatever it takes to defend Taiwan from a Chinese attack, once again followed by assurances which says no real change in our basic policy, which is still guided by the TRA. And of course, in the Trump administration, we had everything from everything is on the table, including our one China policy, to the reversion to more standard positions. So the TRA's high status and its stable content have been much of the game here. And they've also enabled US leaders and officials to play, sometimes implicitly, a 2-level game. If Beijing starts pressing for changes and greater accommodation of its position on Taiwan, US officials, though they don't say this explicitly, I think it's in the background, say, well, I've got the TRA, what can I do? The executive branch is not free to completely disregard that. It provides a convenient constraint, or at least an excuse, and it's more formidable than something like the communiques, which in the US view are mere policy precedents and serious statements that the president will be free to revise or set aside.
At the same time, the TRA has endured
and been enduringly valuable because it's fixed, but it's also flexible. Indeed, it's facilitated repeated adaptations of the largely stable US agenda of maintaining peace and stability across the Strait, as different pressures in the real world have required policy adjustments. We've been through 8 presidents in the US, 4 in Taiwan, or 5 in Taiwan, and 4 4 leaders in China. And in all of those contexts, we've managed to sort of adapt to the new challenges. The flexibility here, the TRA's ability to adapt to a world in which China is more assertive, Taiwan feels more imperiled, and where the US sometimes waxes and sometimes wanes in its commitment to the values issues like democracy and human rights. The flexibility has been there, and it works in part because the TRA is so modest in its substance. The TRA purports to impose only relatively limited constraints on the president and the US administration. Under the TRA, the president retains great discretion on the timing and scale of any arms sales, on the substance of the quasi-diplomatic relations, and on the extent and forms of US support to Taiwan's international participation and Taiwan's security. If the TRA had tried to do a lot more in terms of binding the executive branch, it would have denied US policy the necessary flexibility, and it would have transgressed norms in US constitutional practice and even constitutional law, which gives the president a great deal of authority and discretion in foreign affairs. The TRA thus has lastingly aligned with flexibility and ambiguity in the details of the US approach to keeping peace and stability on the status quo in the Strait. It's reflected in many US statements, such as in many attempts to summarize US policy, phrases like strategic ambiguity. Well, TRA allows for a lot of ambiguity. Or my personal favorite, the one China policy, which means whatever we say it means, but we know it doesn't mean Beijing's one China principle. TRA is perfectly fine with that. Now, given the TRA's history as the legislative foundation of Taiwan policy, the question is, what are we to make of the recent raft of Taiwan legislation? From 2016, 2018 on, we've seen a whole bunch. And we didn't see it for decades, really, after the TRA was adopted. So why all the burst and what to make of it? And you know the list, right? It's an alphabet soup. The Taipei Act, the Taiwan Travel Act, the Asian Reassurance Initiative Act, the ARIA, several provisions in National Defense Authorization Acts, and so on. These are all, I think, fairly characterized as being pro-Taiwan, as advocating continuing and in some respects strengthened US support for Taiwan, its security, and its international participation. But much of this legislation explicitly affirms the TRA, it quotes it and cites it. And much of it is consistent with the principal US policies and practices pursued over decades. And virtually all of it follows the TRA template in not really purporting to require the president and the executive branch to do much. It's hortatory. This is our policy. We think you should do this. Or it is superfluous, authorizing the president to do things the president already can do, like port calls by ships, higher level meetings, and so on. And these new laws rarely go beyond urging the administration to adopt policies or take actions that are more supportive of Taiwan, but again, without many teeth. Maybe it requires reporting requirements, maybe the implicit threat is more legislation, but not a whole lot. So why do it? Well, there's obviously some concern about signaling support for Taiwan and signaling to China that the US remains committed, but I would argue that the TRA should retain its place and not be cluttered up by a bunch of other legislation. As I said, it doesn't add much substantively, but rhetoric in legislation that is sharper or more inflexible in its commitments to Taiwan, or that revises or supplements the TRA, can only do so much to address what are the real challenges facing US policy on cross-straits issues today. And this recent proliferation of pro-Taiwan lawmaking risks doing more harm than good. It imperils the TRA's sort of standing above everything else as the enduring pillar, a lodestar and an anchor for US policy, and as a shield against pressures from Beijing to make more concessions. Some elements in the recent legislation are too easily read, sometimes fairly, as heavy on symbolism and light on substance. I think the symbolism-substance distinction is actually much murkier, and that a lot of things that people denounce as symbolism actually do matter substantively, but it's still a fair point. And it also feeds the critique that US policy pays too much attention to deterring China and reassuring Taiwan, offering only the stick toward China of threats of negative consequences if China does not act the way the US does, but not giving enough attention to the carrot of assurances of better outcomes for China if it is more compliant. Now, we can have a discussion about what those assurances look like. I think they're actually very hard to come up with good ones. So I would like to sort of make the transition to the second part of this talk by saying that one of the testaments to how potent and successful the TRA has been is that funhouse mirror imitation turns out to be the sincerest form of flattery. China adopted an anti-secession law, which in some ways is kind of an homage to the TRA. It too is a piece of domestic legislation that seeks to address the Taiwan question, and that seeks to do it in a way that subtly makes points about international law. It too is at some level pro-status quo, but the anti-secession law falls fundamentally short of the TRA as an anchor for policy stability and situational stability. The anti-secession law is operationally restrained. Nothing has to happen now. There's no timetable. But it makes a conditional threat that China would use force if Taiwan were to attempt secession, or if some other state, the United States, were to get involved in the internal affairs. But the anti-secession law, unlike the TRA, is conceptually highly assertive on matters of international law. As I said, the TRA can be perfectly agnostic about what Taiwan is. We're just going to treat it like it's a state. But the anti-secession law claims Taiwan's status is already settled. It's clearly a part of China. And if it dares to try to get away, then there will be hell to pay. Of course, the problem is the TRA recognizes and supports a true factual status quo across the strait, whereas it's rather hard to square Beijing's characterization of a de facto autonomous Taiwan as being firmly part of Taiwan or the PRC, an argument that Beijing makes in many areas, not just in its denunciations of the TRA, and that brings me to part two of the talk. The anti-secession law is not the only, or even the only formally legal, or even possibly the most threatening to Taiwan among the arrows in Beijing's quiver for addressing Taiwan's international status, including its legal status, and in turn threatening Taiwan's security. An always important and increasingly central and in some ways successful element in the PRC strategy has been UN General Assembly Resolution 2758, the oh-so-unsexy title for a big deal piece of international something. I won't call it lawmaking because it's not. So why does the issue of Taiwan's international legal status and therefore China's claims about the legal significance of 2758 matter? Well, to put it simply, if Beijing wins acceptance of its proposition that Taiwan is a part of China, or is a part of the People's Republic of China, or that Beijing's One China principle is a settled issue of international law, then Beijing will be in a much stronger position to say that its use or threat to use force against Taiwan is perfectly legitimate. It's an internal matter, including to achieve unification. And it'll be easier for China to argue that the United States and others seeking to prevent or deter coerced unification, including through intervening in a conflict or providing arms, would be internationally unlawful. Now, international law is never going to have the last word on these kinds of weighty issues of war and peace. But being on the right side or the wrong side of law tends to matter politically. If you're on the right side, it's easier to gather collective action among like-minded states. It's easier to strengthen deterrence because you're claiming you're enforcing the rules rather than trying to change them, and so on. Put simply, again, in our world, where you sit on the spectrum from independent sovereign state to mere province in another state matters a great deal in terms of your security and your stature in the world. To take a couple of examples, I used to use this with my students, and my students are now born too late to understand this. If Saddam decides to get a little hinky, would you rather be the Iraqi Kurds or Kuwait? You'd rather be Kuwait. The world takes unkindly to destroying states, but looks the other way on a lot of bad behavior domestically.
Why is Putin gone to this? My students would understand. Why is Putin gone to such lengths?
To say that Ukraine is not a real state, or that Crimea was just sort of given to them when the Soviet Union broke up, but it was really part of Russia. Or that Crimea and Donbass are really Russian because that's what fake referenda have yielded. It's to bring them inside one state's border, so anything done there is domestic. So now to the meat of this part of the story. UN General Assembly Resolution 2758 has for some time, but increasingly, especially during the period since the resolution hit 50, which is always an awkward age, big birthday, China's been doing a lot to try to invoke 2758 in order to press its broader claim that Taiwan is part of China or part of the PRC, or that China's One China principle are settled matters of international law, and more broadly, positions accepted by the international community. So what did 2758 do? Well, Director General Xiao gave you the short form of this. Because I get more minutes, I'll give you the long form of it. It was adopted in 1971, and what it did was transfer the Chinese seat at the UN from the ROC, that of course governed Taiwan and the offshore islands at that point, to the PRC, which governs the Chinese mainland. But China now insists, increasingly stridently, and ever more elaborately, that 2758 did much, much more than that. This Chinese position reached a new level of clarity and assertiveness and a sharper legal dimension in the 2022 white paper. You remember the one that dropped just after Pelosi did her little visit, although it had been drafted for a long time before that. And in that text, it says that 2758 settled once and for all the political, legal, and procedural issues of China's representation at the UN and covered the whole country, including Taiwan. 2758 is a political document encapsulating the One China principle whose legal authority leaves no room for doubt and has been acknowledged worldwide. The white paper also points to, and for most people obscure, interpretation offered in a memo by the UN's Office of Legal Affairs, the principal legal advisory office within the Secretariat. That memorandum, quoted again in the Chinese 22 white paper, says, the specialized agencies of the UN later adopted further resolutions. I'm sorry, this is still in the white paper. The white paper says specialized agencies of the UN later adopted parallel resolutions. So the 2010 opinion from the Office of Legal Affairs says it was clearly stated in the official legal opinions of the Office of Legal Affairs, the UN Secretariat, that the United Nations considers Taiwan as a province of China with no separate status, and the authorities, these are all in scare quotes from the white paper, the authorities in Taipei are not, I don't know why Taipei is in quotes, I understand why authorities is, enjoy any form of government status. At the UN, the island is referred to as Taiwan, province of China. And then the footnote dropped in the white paper to the OLA memorandum. So the white paper asserts that when the US and others characterize Taiwan's status as undetermined, or declare support for Taiwan's meaningful participation in the UN system, they are, quote, acting in violation of Resolution 2758 and international law, and are treating the basic principles of international law with contempt, and are disregarding the accepted norms of international relations. That's a lot. Most of these claims have been foreshadowed or echoed in other PRC sources. You can find it in the 2000 white paper. You can find it in many statements from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Taiwan Affairs Office, and others. So let's take a moment and talk about what 2758 actually says and does.
The PRC's position is that it adopts its One China principle. There's only one China in the world, Taiwan's a part of China, and so on. But the text that supposedly supports these principles says nothing of the kind. The word Taiwan does not appear in 2758. The phrase Republic of China does not appear in 2758 except following the word people, so we'll let that one sit aside. So the only Taiwan-related statement in the resolution is that the General Assembly has decided to expel forthwith the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek from the place which they unlawfully occupy in the United Nations. Fairly read, that's a somewhat oblique reference, of course, to the Republic of China government, or its representatives, which was then still, of course, running things, but sloppy as a matter of international law, which may tell you it's not really an international legal document. Concerning the PRC, the 2758 text is very thin. All it says is that the restoration of the lawful right to the PRC is essential for UN purposes, and it recognizes that the representatives of the government of the PRC are the only lawful representatives of China to the United Nations, and it decides to restore all its rights to the PRC and to recognize the representatives of that government as the only legitimate representatives of China to the UN. Not super exciting stuff, perhaps. And this is also kind of inexact. You could not restore the PRC's rights in the UN because the PRC never had any rights in the UN. It was a question of who got the Chinese seat, and it was the ROC seat until 1971. None of the language, or the rest of the text of 2758, addresses, much less decides, the international legal question, Taiwan's status, whether it's a separate state, a part of China, or something else. In international law, the ROC and the PRC are not states. They are governed states. They were two governments that were rival claimants to be the legitimate government of the same state in 1970, who was the legitimate government of China. And indeed, official PRC statements have accepted the distinction. If you look at the white papers, including the 2022 white paper on Taiwan, which echoes the earlier one, it states that in 1949, the new, that is, the PRC government, replaced the previous, that is, the Kuomintang regime, in a situation where China, and this is the quote, where China as a subject of international law, that is, the state, did not change. 2758 does give the PRC for the first time the exclusive role of representing the state of China in the UN and related organizations. WHO most famously with its own Resolution 25.1. 2758 thus transferred the Chinese seat within the UN system from the ROC government to the PRC government. Small beer stuff in some ways. At the same time, we should note that China, the PRC, did not think 2758 solved the Taiwan problem. No less an authority than Zhou Enlai, the premier of China and its former foreign minister at that time, sat down with no less a figure than Henry Kissinger and said, you know that resolution that's about to come through, 2758 will follow? In that Zhou says, in that resolution, it is not possible to put in a clause concerning the status of Taiwan. And if it, that is, the resolution is passed, the status of Taiwan is not yet decided. What we are worried about is that if our legitimate rights in the UN are restored, while the status of Taiwan is left hanging in the air, we will have to consider this matter. Ominous, but it suggests that he doesn't think this thing is so. And if you look at the General Assembly debates, at least the states he's represented in the Free State debate are all over the map on what they think 2758 does. And at least 30 of them explicitly say this is a matter of credentials. Who gets to walk into the UN and exercise China's rights to vote, and so on. Resolution 2758 not only did not purport to resolve Taiwan's international legal status, it couldn't unless the UN was doing something outside its powers. The UN General Assembly has the power to determine who may represent a member state. In conjunction with the Security Council, it can decide to admit a new state as a member. But this is the General Assembly resolution only, and 2758 does not address an issue of membership. The process for admitting a member was never invoked. Indeed, a U.S. effort to get a call to an important question was defeated, so this sounds like a pretty mundane thing of representation. More fundamentally, the UN lacks the independent power to decide the international legal status of Taiwan. It's not a legislature. We don't have a legislature in the international system. It's not a court. The closest thing they have to a court in the international system of writ large, the International Court of Justice, only gets cases when the parties consent to be judged there, and it's hard to imagine this one going to the ICJ, and of course, it hasn't. Thus, the simplest form of China's argument, that Resolution 2758 settled the question, comes up short, both on substance and process. The uses and abuses of 2758 in China's arguments, however, don't stop with simple interpretations of the resolution. There are a few principal areas where China has worked within the UN system in an attempt to create consequences beyond the UN as well, and I'll turn to the key examples of that now and show why it continues the pattern of misinterpreting UN interpretations and precedent. So the 2010 memorandum from the Office of Legal Affairs that's quoted in the 2022 China White Paper says, since the adoption of that resolution, 2758, the United Nations considers Taiwan as a province of China with no separate status. And the Secretariat strictly abides by this decision in the exercise of its responsibilities. Since the adoption of the resolution, the established practice in the UN has been to use the term Taiwan become a province of China when a reference to Taiwan is required in UN Secretariat documents. This memo came in the context, its interpretation came in the context of the Universal Periodic Review report filed by State 1, it's NARA, back when it was diplomatic ally of Taiwan, where basically they thanked Taiwan or the Republic of China for help in their preparing the report and improving their human rights situation. And so China objected to the publication. China, by the way, was State 2, also about name, but it's not too hard to figure out. China objected to the publication and argued, quote, according to the memo, argued that its publication by the Secretariat is in violation of General Assembly Resolution 2758. But this OLA memorandum does much less than Beijing claims. Beijing essentially only quotes that first half of the sentence. Since the adoption of the resolution, the UN considers Taiwan to be part of China.
It ignores the solution to the problem. So much of the rest of that paragraph is about very mundane stuff, right? Who gets to do certain things in the UN? What has to be in a UN document? It's an intra-UN kind of thing. It doesn't sweep more broadly. But in addition to that, it ignores the solution to the problem that China raised that the OLA came up with, noting that the Secretariat has an obligation not to comment on the terminology contained in reports submitted by member states, because that would be interfering with the intergovernmental process, the sovereignty of those states. OLA recommended a footnote, which says, the document has been reproduced as received. The designations employed do not imply the expression of any opinion whatsoever on the part of the Secretariat concerning the legal status of any country, territory, or area, or of its authorities. You should not consume this memorandum if you're allergic to any of its ingredients. So I mean, it's clearly a pushback against that over-reading. And that kind of notation had been standard UN practice for years, since the 1990s when under Li Denghui, Taiwan started to try to rebuild engagement and participation to some degree in the UN. But Beijing has been relentless, and the UN has often been acquiescent in this kind of pressure on nomenclature with its supposed implications for Taiwan's status. So to take one example, UNDESA, the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, receives voluntary national reviews, VNRs, about the implementation of sustainable development goals as part of the human rights process. And for a long time, that had gone more or less the way that footnote suggested it should go. These documents get submitted with Taiwan's diplomatic partners having the temerity to refer to Taiwan or the Republic of China and not say province. But then, starting around 2018 or so, UNDESA stopped posting reports if you didn't say the magic words. And so Taiwan's diplomatic allies were put to the choice of putting in Taiwan province of China, of leaving the phrase out altogether, or of not having their reports posted in the ordinary course. A lot of pushback. The situation has since been resolved, but it's an example. So that's one strand where China has made these kinds of gains. The second one is that China has been fairly successful in getting, or at least UN sources have been willing, whether or not pressured, to produce statements by UN officials and sources that says that the UN considers Taiwan for all intents and purposes to be part of China or the People's Republic of China. Lots of examples of this over the years. The most high profile and intense one was in 2007 when Taiwan's diplomatic allies tried to submit for the General Assembly's consideration a proposal for Taiwan's membership. In that context, Ban Ki-moon, then the Secretary General, said, he said at a press conference, the matter which you asked me was carefully considered by the Secretariat. And in light of the resolution which I have mentioned, 2758, it was not legally possible to receive the purported application for membership. Ban also said, the position of the United Nations is that Taiwan is part of China. The UN took similar positions in refusing to accept Taiwan's instruments of accession to the human rights covenants of the UN and so on. And here again, we have an OLA memo, a second memo from the same year, although one that China doesn't quote as much. And it has somewhat familiar language at this point in my talk. Since the adoption of this resolution and in accordance with the decisions which it contains, the UN has considered Taiwan for all intents and purposes, for all purposes, to be an integral part of the People's Republic of China without any separate status. Well, this is kind of like the other OLA memorandum. Here again, there's less than seemingly meets the eye, and less than that supports Beijing's views. For example, when asked if the return of the application of documents from Taiwan meant that the UN could never be allowed to consider Taiwan's application, the Secretary General responded that that is a matter that is up to the membership. It gets to decide for itself whether to consider. For another example, the OLA memorandum, although again including the kind of rhetoric that sounds like it takes a very strong position, is again, like the first one, operationally narrow. It's an issue of, it actually came with the context of the very narrow issue of whether someone using an ROC Taiwan passport could get into a CEDAW, the Discrimination Against Women conference, and the answer was no, but here the UN practice has been very inconsistent over the years, and there was an easy answer that didn't require you to say anything about whether Taiwan was a province of China. It's simply the ROC government is not a government represented in the UN representing a state, so its passports don't get the kind of treatment that US and Russian and Chinese passports do. which was the position the OLA had earlier taken, just 1 year earlier, keeping it as a narrow decision. So third strand here, leveraging the 2758 language on recognition. If you look at 2758, there's stuff that sounds like recognition. Recognition is a big deal. Like you get recognized as a state, you get recognized as the government in the international system. 2758 says recognizing that the representatives of the PRC are the only lawful representatives of China to the UN. Well, that's nice, but that's preamble language. It's not legal recognition. And the other phrase is that the resolution undertakes to recognize the representatives of the PRC's government as the only representatives of China to the UN. Well, that bit of language is limited again, as I said earlier about 2758, to the narrow question of who holds the Chinese seat in the UN. But there's something more fundamental here. The UN is extremely clear that the UN is not in the business of recognizing states and governments. This dates, ironically enough, to a 1950 memo from then Secretary General Lai, who said, in response to a question raised on behalf of the PRC, since the PRC is really governing China, shouldn't it be representing China, said, no, we don't do recognition. Recognition is a matter for member states, not for the United Nations. It would be inconsistent with the way member states have addressed the UN's powers, and after all, the UN's powers derive only from states. Beyond that, recognition really doesn't matter for international status, whether you're a state or not. Those are factual questions. If you're a state or a government, well, if you're a state, it depends on whether you have a stable population, a stable territory, a government that doesn't answer to any other government, and the capacity to engage in international relations, which, at least if you count informal international relations, Taiwan does pretty well on all four of those. Withholding recognition doesn't change your legal status as a state. Shouldn't anyway, principle. And so too with the government. We don't care if the government came to power lawfully at some point if they're de facto government, that's all that counts. Diplomatic relations, you can make or break those as you wish. So none of this really speaks to Taiwan's status. And exclusion or expulsion from the UN and universal lack of recognition as a state by other states and the UN doesn't, again, settle the question. Fourth and finally in this list, 2758 has become an increasingly important element in China's broader argument that Taiwan is a part of China, or the PRC, as a matter of international law binding on all states and all international organizations well beyond the UN context. Essentially a matter of customary international law. The 2022 white paper gets pretty close to this. It says that actions such as professing that the status of Taiwan is undetermined or supporting Taiwan's meaningful participation in the UN system are, quote, violations of Resolution 2758 and international law. Beijing has tried to link 2758 to Taiwan's international legal status as a question, again, well outside the UN, and it's had some success in recent times. Parlacen, the Central American parliamentary body, kicked Taiwan out, saying that it was doing this consistent with Resolution 2758 and its implication that Taiwan was a province of China and thus not a country suited to be an observer. After Lai Ching-te won the election in January 2024, we saw the latest loss of diplomatic ally, Nauru. You remember their state number one. Nauru shifted its diplomatic ties from Taipei to Beijing and stated that we will be moving on to the one China principle that is in line with Resolution 2758. The President of the General Assembly made a similar statement. But China's apparent argument here once again falls short. Beijing's one China principle is a really poor candidate for being a principle of customary international law. It's way too specific. These are general rules. Secondly, a rule of customary international law must reflect the general and consistent practices of states, and states must act in consistently with that principle on the basis that they see it as a legal obligation, not a mere policy choice. 2758 doesn't meet these criteria either. The state practice of having diplomatic relations with the PRC much more than they do with the ROC also doesn't work, and the PRC's claim is incorrect even in saying that all states or almost all states have established diplomatic relations on the basis of accepting China's one China principle. Many states will say one China principle, but they don't mean Beijing's one China principle. The US explicitly bases its relationship on a one China policy that is not the one China principle, and so on. And again, diplomatic recognition is way down the chain from anything about statehood. So, the story I've been telling, at too much length here, is the result of pressure and persuasion by China that has first taken advantage of structural features of the UN, including its one country, one vote system, and the fact that Taiwan is just not a salient issue for most countries in the world, but it's very important to Beijing. And of course, Taiwan has been excluded from the discussion because it can't participate in UN meetings and so on. And secondly, Beijing's pressure and persuasion have pushed against a somewhat open door. UN officials have been relatively receptive, whether because they've been socialized into it or they don't hear from Taiwan, or because many senior officials, including the heads of some UN bodies, UN specialized agencies, are PRC nationals. So with a few minutes left, that brings me full circle. In the face of the sustained Chinese efforts focusing on international law and invoking Resolution 2758, and given the stakes in terms of the legality and in turn the political feasibility of the US and the international community, including like-minded states, to support Taiwan's security in a crisis, and to therefore be the source of a credible deterrent against Chinese coercion, what should we do? The issue is, if the US seeks to continue to pursue its long-term strategy of supporting stability and the status quo in the cross-strait situation, then does it need to start focusing on supplementing the TRA? Is a domestic law solution no longer adequate where China is pushing international legal arguments? Do we need a more international law-focused response to 2758? Well, if the goal is continuity here, the US has done some of this. There's some of it that's visible to the public, some of it isn't. Among the visible parts, the US issued a non-paper in 2007, which noted with concern Beijing's insistence that the UN and member states use the nomenclature for Taiwan as province of China, one that suggests endorsement of China's sovereignty claims. And the US expressed concerns that some UN organizations had asserted that UN precedent required Taiwan to be referred to by those names. The same document took issue with UN documents that asserted that UN precedent required Taiwan be treated as part of the PRC or was for all intents and purposes an integral part of the PRC. And it warned that in these circumstances, the US will be obliged to dissociate itself from the Secretariat's position if that office insists on using such nomenclature for Taiwan and insists on describing Taiwan as part of China. WikiLeaks gives us a little insight here. Apparently, US Ambassador to the UN, Khalizad, and diplomats from Canada and Japan had some rather testy meetings
with senior UN staff, including Ban, including the Assistant Secretary General for the Office of Legal Affairs.
After which Ban said, "I went too far," at least WikiLeaks tells us that, and said he would no longer use the phrase Taiwan as a part of China. Now he backslid from that, but it was something. And of course, most recently, Laura Rosenberger, the AIT chair, shows up in Taipei shortly after the elections when Nauru switches allegiances and says, "It is disappointing to see distorted narratives about UN Resolution 2758 being used as a tool to pressure Taiwan, limit its voice on the international stage, and influence its diplomatic relationships." Taiwan's allies have also often pushed back. If you go into the UN's digitized archives, there are reams of pages of letters saying, "We think you got bad legal advice when you rejected the application in 2007, and of course China weighs in and says, "No, you got good legal advice." There's a lot of lobbying going on both sides here. And ultimately, there was a lot of pushback against the refusal of UNDESA to post the VNRs because it was insulting to the sovereignty of the admitting states, and they've now switched that back to accepting them again. So you can go, good news, you can go if you have a lot of spare time or you can't sleep, you can go to the UNDESA website, look up St. Kitts and Nevis and a bunch of other countries, and now you will see Taiwan in their VNRs, or Republic of China. But beyond that, there's a question of what US policy could be if it wants to pursue its long-standing ends. And here I'll close with a couple of suggestions. One is to be pretty relentless in calling out the flaws in China's legal arguments about the implications and status of 2758. It'd be useful to shine a little sunlight and exert a little counter pressure against what I think has often been just kind of accidental or lazy or legally uninformed behavior by UN officials that have acquiesced in Chinese positions. It's probably also worth making the argument, I think Director General Xiao also referred to this, that accepting China's position on what 2758 means, especially in terms of the UN, is that it undermines UN commitments to developing the international rule of law and to universal representation. And I think it's also possible to frame this as an example, a particularly high profile and fraught and significant one, an example of China's attempt to destabilize existing rules of a rules-based international order that the US has long supported, albeit somewhat intermittently and arguably decreasingly, and that has served the interests of the US, Taiwan, and the broader global community for a good deal longer than either the TRA or 2758 has been around. Thank you.
Studying abroad in Taiwan, I had the privilege of meeting the first ever female vice president or some other really similar at our political position. So I was wondering about how it's going when the female representation.
Well, I mean, Taiwan does extremely well by certainly Asian democratic standards, North American ones too, for that matter. Taiwan has its first female president who is just ending her term in May, and it will have its first female vice president with Xiaobi Kim coming in. So and Taiwan has a significant number of women in the legislature. Actually, there used to be a provision that may still be in the Constitution requiring certain minimum representation, but you can get there pretty much naturally. So. Taiwan's done certainly by Asian standards, and I think even extremely well by Asian standards and well by global democratic standards. Now, is there a lot of sexism kicking around? Sure. I mean, Tsai Ing-wen was, when people were being critical of her, a lot of it was gendered, shall we say, including allegations of improper personal behavior and the kind of snarkiness that tends to target strong and assertive women, right? But all politicians get some of that. There's still that sort of sexist clause, but it tells you something. Taiwanese voters have twice elected a woman as president and have just elected a woman as vice president. And and of course these people have held very high level positions in government before reaching that level of elective office. Tsai Ing-wen was the soon to step down president, was a major trade negotiator. She was an important aide to Li Donghui, and Xiaobi Kim has been the representative, the ambassador equivalent in Washington. So these are highly accomplished people who also speak way better English than most Americans. So that probably helps.
All right, next. Yeah. By the way, I came to with about so family, I didn't know so I can sound about this. But that's it. God, thank you for sharing your knowledge. Do you believe that China's actions against Hong Kong in recent years will have an impact on either the international tolerance for the dental action against Taiwan, or do they impact on the legal precedents that need to be applied?
A lot in that question. We know one big impact that China's treatment of Hong Kong has had, that is, it got Tsai Ing-wen reelected easily. I mean, it was going to be a close race, but when we saw the crackdown on the protests and national security law on that, it took the support for one country, two systems models in Taiwan from somewhere near zero to somewhere well below zero. So that's possible. I mean, it just made it a highly salient issue, and so in that sense it did. But you ask a more interesting question. If you're going to be an international lawyer about this, probably not a whole lot, because Hong Kong never claimed to be and never had any hope of being an independent entity. It was not at the table on the reversion negotiations. That was an agreement between London and Beijing. Hong Kong never had a voice. Chris Patton, the last colonial governor, actually tried to tweak that a little bit because he showed up in Beijing for one of the negotiating sessions and said, "I'm here representing Hong Kong. Who else should I be representing?" And the Chinese said, "You represent the British Foreign Office, so shut up." So in that sense, they're not parallel. There is, however, I think, an issue which is a kind of blend of politics and law, which, by the way, on the mainland is one phrase, 政法, political law, that the joint declaration is mostly treated by China as a solemn agreement, at least approaching the status of a treaty. Now, there's a little bit of waffling there because I'll get that in a second, but if you read, as I think you can, that what Beijing has done vis-a-vis Hong Kong is at least in some serious tension with the promises made in the joint declaration, that would raise the question of what any agreement for reunification with Taiwan or unification with Taiwan would look like. How reliable would that be? And I think the lesson it teaches off of that as well is that what people learn in Hong Kong to their great peril is that once you are, this is back to my Kuwait, Iraqi Kurds point, once you are inside the fence of another state's sovereignty, there's always so much the world can or will do about it. And so I think it reinforces that message. Now back on the sort of the treaty thing, it's kind of interesting because the Chinese position is that both Hong Kong and Taiwan were once part of China, probably never really left China in any legal sense, and therefore any agreement to bring them back lacks the quid pro quo that we think of as being part of a treaty, right? If basically it was never rightfully taken or never taken at all, that it just comes back and there's nothing to restrict China's discretion in exercising its sovereign power at home. It's like the TRA thing I was talking about, how the secession law kind of is a mirror of that. And that's pretty serious stuff. If you take that seriously, then you can do pretty much whatever you want. And if you look at the joint declaration, the British-Chinese joint declaration on Hong Kong, it's almost like the second U.S.-China communique, which is, it's like toddlers doing parallel play. They're not actually agreeing to anything. It's, I'm saying this, and I'm saying this. And so if you read the joint declaration, the government of the United States says this, that, and the other thing, including the U.S. acknowledges that all Chinese on both sides of the strait think there is one China that includes Taiwan, something which China still tries to make an argument out of on some kind of estoppel argument on steroids. But if you look at the joint declaration, it's the same thing. The British say, we have decided to return Hong Kong to China in return for a pledge of 50 years of unchanged rule. And China says, we have decided to resume the exercise of sovereignty as the date which happens to coincide with the date that the British think their treaty rights run out. So, that's the world we live in. Here comes the killer question to the professional diplomat.
If I understood correctly, the resolution to my 758 dealt only the question of who was full government of the entity taught.
I think it doesn't even really do that. It's one step farther. Yeah.
Wondering if that is principle, it's not from land, it's not a state. If you spin the low, how would that bring other nations? In kind of Britain, pharmaceutical labor coming.
Right, so this is one of those really unfortunate areas where international lawyers use words that have ordinary meanings in ways that aren't their ordinary meanings, which is designed partly to confuse and partly to justify extremely high hourly rates. But I think, basically think of the structure this way. A state is a relatively durable entity of population and territory. So there's a state of China which goes back at least to the Qing dynasty, maybe before. Its borders change, it loses Outer Mongolia and stuff like that. But it's basically, there's a state of China. It may or may not have lost Taiwan, we can talk about that. But it's an ongoing state of China. When the Soviet Union broke up, Russia continued, and the other things spun off from it. So these are states that continued. Really big changes in regime count as changes of government. So the ROC to the PRC was a change of government on the mainland. The Soviet Union to the Russian Federation was a change of government in a big chunk, although hardly all, of the Soviet Union, and so on. Mere alternations of parties in power, like a Labour government versus a Tory government, Democratic Party versus a Republican Party versus a MAGA government, whatever. These are just, unless January 6th went a lot farther, these are not regime changes. These are just changes of incumbents of an ongoing government. So state, big, hard to change. Governments require almost revolutionary change to be a new government. Who holds the positions within a government, one party taking power after an election? That's just at the very superficial level. What 2758 does is it assumes that there is a state of China which is a member state of the United Nations. And the question is, which government gets to represent that state, gets to occupy that seat at the UN? And it is technically even narrower than that, because the question is ultimately a question of what human beings get to walk into the building and cast the ballot or make the speech holding up the sign that says China. And there, it's even at that shallow level because this notion of the forces of Chiang Kai-shek, which weren't even really recognized as being the equivalent of the ROC. But that's a quibble. I think it's fair to think of it as it is a question of which government represents China. But you don't get new governments except through really constitutional discontinuities, revolutions, things like that.
Since the recent administrations in Congress, as we that actually is more and more favorable to Taiwan. And if that's the case, is there something more that the U.S. administration or government can do at the UN to follow, for instance, swing left and Europe as well?
To influence the UN? I'm doing my Marco Rubio First Nation here. I stopped to get water. Yeah, so I think you're right to characterize the recent years have brought stronger, more bipartisan, and more sort of cross-branch Congress and the executive support for Taiwan. I think that largely reflects, I promise not to repeat my talk from this afternoon. I think that largely reflects the ongoing U.S. commitment to an uncoerced solution and de facto support for the status quo. It's just become harder to do that in an era where China is being more powerful and more assertive, and where there's growing doubt in Taiwan about the U.S. Reliability, the email and stuff, right? And again, that's overstated, but there has been a shift. So I think that the problem is to continue to do what we used to do, which was deter China from attacking Taiwan or coercing Taiwan, and deter leaders in Taiwan from crossing a red line of a July 4th-like moment, declaring a Republic of Taiwan or something. That now looks very different. It's all about reassuring Taiwan and pressuring China. And I think that's what you're talking about reflects all that. The problem is, if we're talking about trying to have an impact on China's 2758 centered strategy, I think China's reaction to that is, look, why should we be compliant? You're all stick and no carrot. And there's a reason for that. As described, I think it makes it very hard to budge China on that. And so I think the better U.S. move, if it wants to try to move that pendulum internationally back a little farther, is really to not be sort of super insistent on that, because it risks exposing the very real differences among like-minded states about how strong to be in support of Taiwan. I mean, we're not all quite on the same page, although we're all concerned about China. And it also, I think, leaves on the table the arguments that are more powerful in an international law and even international relations context, which is to talk about systemic interests. And if you let this happen, then you're letting China portray the UN as doing things the UN is not even empowered to do, and that are things the UN has not even purported to do. You're turning a blind eye and a deaf ear to actions by China that are corrosive of rules that we rather like, sometimes for benevolent reason, sometimes for self-interested reason, and you fail to make the somewhat potent normative arguments that full marginalization of Taiwan is a terrible idea because it excludes Taiwan's participation in helping to deal with climate change and public health and all these other things. And if China may overplay its hand and push Taiwan so far into a corner that it winds up with a crisis it doesn't even want. Okay, you take the last diplomatic ally, what does Taiwan do then? Scarier world.
Hi, with the brief jury standing of the TIA, which has got from different bipartisan sessions from Carter to findings and me.
Couple of Bushes, a Trump, yeah.
It actually makes the decision in Washington. He said that permanent bureaucracy is there a tacit understanding between the two parties, about making these long-term strategic decisions.
Yes. I mean, it's a little bit of all these things, right? I think that for much of the relevant period, a fair calculation of U.S. interests says the world is better for the United States if Taiwan is de facto allied with the United States, so long as it doesn't blow up U.S.-China relations. And when it looks like it's going to blow up U.S.-China relations, we worry about it. But now they're already broken. Taiwan's not going to be the problem. So I think there's a long-term strategic interest that hasn't really changed, and in some ways it's gotten stronger as the U.S.-China relationship has become more adversarial. There is a long tradition in really both parties, so it's kind of baked into the DNA. As I think Bob Sutter was saying earlier today, in Congress they don't have a lot of time to focus on foreign policy, and so once one of these things gets set in, it's very hard to change. And as Bob was saying in our conference, we've had one of those moments. I mean, I think this post-2016 wave of legislation reflects that reconsideration of where Taiwan is in U.S. thinking, and where China especially is in the U.S. Thinking of threats out there in the world. So they all make it sort of a level of analysis problem. The really basic stuff, I think, is interests and every layer of institution and history and stuff like that. The more fine-grained stuff, ultimately, of course, done by the executive. I mean, arms sales, whether to have port calls, whether to allow a minister-level Taiwanese official to meet inside the Beltway, what Laura Rosenberger is going to say when she goes to Taipei after the election and Nauru does a little flip-flop. By the way, Nauru, it's not the first time Nauru's flipped. They're a very waffly kind of place, apparently. But those decisions are made within the executive branch, and because it's such a fraught relationship, I'm sure they go nowhere without a presidential sign-off, although, of course, it's influenced by senior advisors. But a lot of what goes on, I think, is kind of analogous to what I was saying about the UN. A lot of the less high-profile, ordinary day-to-day stuff, it just goes on autopilot. People get, they rotate into an office where they've got senior colleagues who've been doing this, and it's just all habit. And and its institutional culture. And I think that's what has to be fought against in the UN if you want to stop China from making the gains it has. But the bureaucracy chugs along. You can call that the permanent state, or you can call it civil servants doing their job. Yeah, that's true. We have somebody here who can speak to that from authority. Do you make the decision?
It's a little, no, and yet I job where speech stage and tone. So my question is like, Taiwan now, as now we have 12 allies that provide cyber and everything. General Assembly have meetings in Hamburg. Our allies can go OEM and vouch for us, and that's very pertinent to this stuff.
Yeah, the lobbies at Waijiao looks a little more sparse every time we go there.
Okay. Like I'm working to be ally Taiwan and foreseeable future level, I can empower. We're gonna have a lot of less people in UN at the mouth sorts, right? So the balance of power, there's a Taiwan, the China, discussing this at the UN. How would that pan out? Like Taiwan's ally just continue to drop to its number? What would the US do? Like the US thing? No.
Well, right. So the diplomatic allies play a small but crucial role. I mean, these are obviously not great powers, right? I mean, Paraguay is the biggest one left at this point. One in Europe, and that's the Vatican. One in Africa, it changed its name, so nobody really knows what Eswatini is. It's in former Swadia. I don't mean any disrespect. These are countries, that have survived despite they survived very difficult international circumstances. But these are not great powers. They're never going to get a permanent seat on the Security Council. But they matter because they can sort of keep making this case. And one of the things, so part of this talk is based on a report that's coming out next week. But I got into just, the UN the UN Secretary General's office has amazing digitized archives that are fully searchable. And if you go into it, there's just this constant drumbeat of China trying to push those strands I was talking about on nomenclature and the statement that Taiwan's a part of China and all that. And the diplomatic allies are at the forefront of pushing back. And sometimes they're really sophisticated legal arguments. Some of them have foreign lawyers who work pretty well with the UN system and know how to play these games. So how many do you need? I don't know, because you're never going to be anywhere near the number of votes that are actually going to change anything. So as long as you have a few who will introduce this every year and keep up the pressure. And by the way, I don't know this for a fact, but I would be shocked if Tico New York were not in touch with the diplomatic allies suggesting what arguments would be good and what arguments are not so good. In fact, I do know that for a fact, but I don't want to say in a record. But so that will go on. How do you substitute for the loss? Well, part of it is, and this is part of what I think you've seen the U.S. start to do a little bit, and the U.S. and other like-minded states can do, which is although they won't play the role the diplomatic allies do, they will be more vocal and more public and present. There's a lot of private stuff that goes on. But I think things like the 2007 non-paper, which by the way wasn't released, it sort of leaked out. It wasn't done as a big official document. So I think you'll see more of the U.S. and others doing things that are consistent with things that are the U.S. One China policy or other states that have similar things to do the pushback without going fully where the diplomatic allies can go. The other thing is I don't think it's in China's interest to squeeze Taiwan to zero for two reasons. One is, either of two bad scenarios. One is that Taiwan gets backed into a corner. And if it really feels like, this is the moment China's laying the groundwork for upping the coercion and we can't count on the allies and partners to push back, then, it could get dangerous. Taiwan could do something rash. The other more likely thing is that if Taiwan sees the handwriting on the wall and maybe getting close to that, Taiwan can do what the kids call code switching. Instead of talking about its dozen remaining allies, it leans a lot more heavily on the fact that Taiwanese ROC nationals can enter visa-free way more countries than most people can. Taiwan has TICO and TECRO offices and their equivalents, which have bigger staffs than embassies of all but a handful of countries. Taiwan's an active member of the World Trade Organization and APEC. Just switch to saying it's informal relations that matter. And I think that's actually worse for Beijing. Beijing has benefited from Taiwan's sometimes overzealous concern with keeping formal diplomatic relations.
Was think about that being most respectfully, I think on the us as always communist states.
And you can always hope for, other multinational empires to break up and give you new states, right? I mean, if some piece of Eritrea will now break off, or there'll be another Soviet collapse or something like that.
In China, I think wars are by leading state hash, but people see budget and South China Sea.
Is that used to boost back on it? Doesn't at least
It's helpful in the sense that states that have an earned reputation for not taking international legal decisions terribly seriously probably lose a little credibility in the gray area cases with the ability to push the envelope. The U.S. has some problems there too, of course. We have not always implemented decisions fully, and more often we've sort of ducked to the decision, right? So we withdrew from the ICJ after the Nicaragua thing, and we've done. We never signed the Law of the Sea Convention, although we claim its substantive provisions are binding, all that. But I think it actually, I think it certainly hurts reputationally. And it feeds the broader narrative that China is trying to remake international legal rules in a way that suit China's interests, which is what great powers do. It's not surprising. But the problem is that because we don't have a legislature, we don't have a court, the only way to change rules is, aside from multilateral treaties, which are hard to do, is to start breaking them until they change if they're customary. And there's a long history of states doing that, but there is the complicated transitional moment. I think we're still not so far down that pike that the old rules are in such disarray that we can't do better by saying, this is corrosive of a rules-based international order, which has served everyone, including China, for the last few decades pretty well. So at least to warn them that it's not self-interested and to use that as a basis for rallying to the pushback against China, whether it's Taiwan or elsewhere, states that don't feel like they have a huge stake in it, because they do have the systemic change.
It's something about back there, the divine Louis as to represent combined with a cheerleading.
Yeah. Right. So the Venn diagram of being a state at international law and being in the United Nations, pretty close to two concentric circles over fully, but not entirely. Switzerland didn't join the UN until the last 10 years, 20 years, something like that. Switzerland's a new member of the UN, even though nobody doubted it was a state. You point to the two Koreas and the two Germanys. There were also 3 Soviet seats, right? 2 of the SSRs, Belarus and Ukraine, I think actually was it, had separate seats in the UN, even though nobody thought they were states. Palestine, Palestinian people, rights and self-determination, all that, but the idea that Palestine is a state, it's not. Functionally, it's not, right? The West Bank is carved up and Gaza's rubble, and they have not been autonomously governing for quite some time. So you can be in the UN, although Palestine's not a member, but if you see their plaque, it says State of Palestine, their observer state. So you can be in the UN not being a state, you can be not in the UN and be a state, so it doesn't really work. The Germany-Korea thing is really interesting because if each side is willing to let the other side be there, then there's no real problem. And both Germany much more successfully than Korea found a way of of navigating that. And there was a time, this is mostly during the Chen Shui-bian years in Taiwan, where there was an attempt to invoke the Korea and Germany model as a basis for Taiwan being represented. The argument being that in both the German case and certainly the Korean case, there was not bilateral acceptance that these were 2 permanently separate states or even necessarily 2 legitimate in one another's eyes states. That was more a Korea problem than a Germany problem, but they could both be in the UN, and so why not? But those days were gone by the time we got really to Taiwan seeking entry. Because one other piece I didn't get to in the talk is that perhaps the most outlandish of Beijing's arguments is that since in 1971, the position of the representative of Chiang Kai-shek, the ROC, was that there was but one China that included Taiwan. And back then they agreed, right? That therefore we are forever stuck with that position, and Taiwan is never allowed to revisit it in effect. And by the time we got to the 1990s under Li Donghui, when Taiwan started to try to re-engage the UN and seek some form of participation, and by the time we got to the Chen years, where there were actual dalliances with membership applications, the Korea and Germany things, the Korea thing had settled in and the Germany thing had ended.
It does see you as
we got a repeat customer.
I was just wondering if you were able to predict.
No.
No. Yeah, I'm listening. When see is the Taiwan did it with this as
I think it didn't surprise her that she went. There are a bunch of things going on there. One is, Pelosi wanted to go, right? She clearly wanted to go, and there are reasons she wanted to go. She was in her waning days as Speaker of the House. She knew that because she'd agreed to step down the election. I think she saw something of a kindred spirit and counterpart at Tsai Ing-wen. I mean, a woman leader of a very high position in a democracy. And she has a very long history of being very tough on China. She represents the Chinatown district in San Francisco, which when she started representing it, I think was still probably more ROC than PRC. But she's also been very strong on human rights. She was one of the real proponents of sanctioning China seriously after Tiananmen, when China nearly lost its trading privileges with the U.S. So I think it was a personal thing for her. And so, she's been talking about going. Newt Gingrich went, and I think that farted. She wasn't going to be one up by Gingrich on that. And I don't think the White House pushed back very hard against her going. I mean, there's a rumor around Washington that I have no idea if this is true, but it sounds true. That she said, if Biden wants to tell me not to go, I'll consider not going, but short of the president making a personal request. But at the same time, it was going to be provocative, and everybody knew it. Taiwan had no choice but to say, we welcome the visit by so high level an American, merely 2 heartbeats away from the presidency and all that sort of stuff. And it was a nice sort of show of U.S. support. But if you got diplomatic officials, senior foreign ministry people at Taiwan to tell you the truth, I think they would say it was not exactly a great time to take a vacation or to expect to get a lot of sleep. It was clearly going to get blowback, and it did. Did it do any good or for harm to Taiwan? Hard to say. I mean, I think probably it was not that beneficial and probably a net negative, but largely for a couple of reasons, a couple circumstances. One is that we talked about the way in which the Congress and presidents have already gone very pro-Taiwan. If we were in an environment where the U.S. support for Taiwan had been squishier, a visit by the Speaker of the House would have been a significant uptick. But we've had all these high-level visits, recently retired officials, and lots of signal support. The other thing is it allowed China to get away with doing those military exercises, which some people are calling the fourth cross-strait crisis. I guess it's a bit of an exaggeration, but allowed them to do it in a way that looked better in the eyes of world public opinion. That is, it was accepted that China was going to have some room to do something pretty forceful in response to a provocation. If she had not gone, would they have done that military exercise? Maybe, but it would have cost them more.
Well, thank you for your good presentation, Cindy. I actually was out at the note. One, as he was ambassadors accompanying President Pao in events at the Speaker. So a great deal about TRA, ballast and relationship, very durable piece of legislation that provides significant flexibility, ambiguity. You also mentioned over many since in the past few years, a number of different pieces of legislation, some passed, some not, by the Congress. And such about this issue that crazy in Washington by power, like they do like that. At least you stated ambiguity versus creation is clarity in terms of protecting and preserving Watson's international space, prevent the difficulties through the UN competency, but perhaps other ways, other means to try to, at not large, at least attack a wild engagement as.
Yeah, so at the very end of my talk, I think some of those things are not UN-centric, and indeed the idea is to get it out of the UN where China has structural advantages and political leverage and the habit of the Secretariat and specialized agencies. So to get it out of that into a more general international discussion where it's states writ large and where the difference in power and clout among states matters, it's not a one vote, one system, one state system, is a good thing to do. On strategic clarity versus strategic ambiguity, the question is whether one means that prescriptively or descriptively. Descriptively, I think everything Biden has done, the 4 statements, are actually consistent with strategic ambiguity, because strategic ambiguity always was fairly clear that if China undertook an unprovoked military attack on Taiwan, we were going to be there. Although it's not strategic ambiguity, it's just not strategy. It's just, take it if you want. So I think that was he stayed within that envelope. What's become difficult is that strategic ambiguity was always associated with dual deterrence. Deter China from coercing Taiwan, deter Taiwan from declaring independence, right? And you don't have to deter Taiwan these days. You do have to deter China, although I don't think China's about to attack. You have to worry about, when do they start thinking that either time is not on their side, so they have to act now, or time has gone on long enough. So I think there are reasons to do that, and they're not just Taiwan focused. It's trying to deter China in a lot of areas, including some where I think it will be more assertive than it would be vis-a-vis Taiwan, because structures there. In terms of prescription, though, I think going from strategic ambiguity to a declared or semi-declared policy of strategic clarity would be a bad idea for at least a couple of reasons. Sorry for people who are in the room earlier. I've heard this answer before, but the risk with doing that is you then are in the realm of symbol over substance, right? That is, I'm going to declare that now my policy is clear, whereas before it's ambiguous. And it's always been clear about the stuff that counts. We're never going to make it really clear about the marginal cases. Not the stuff that counts, but the stuff that's easy. And if you engage in strategic clarity, the next question is what's on the list and what's off the list. And if you leave something on the list that you wanted to put on the list, then China's going to cry foul. Oh, you've moved the goalposts, and then China has the rhetorical advantage of saying it's the U.S. is trying to change the status quo and not China. And then it's worse yet if you happen to leave something outside, you put something inside the fence that on reflection or as the world changes is not worth dying over. You now have to worry about, well, if I don't stick with that now stupid commitment, I'm going to lose credibility with Taiwan, with Korea, with Japan, and so on. So it just seems to be the risks outweigh the benefits.
All right, so I'm going to do a little bit shameless promotions because we're talking about strategic ambiguity and strategic clarity. Charles and I and other two co-authors actually have a piece coming up in foreign policy analysis to talk about dual clarity of U.S. policy, which should be Googleable maybe in a month. And it's been a long day. And not just for me, because we actually have 3 professors from Taiwan who just arrived like yesterday or day after before yesterday. So for them, they have to stay up for a whole night, which means I need to drive them back to the hotel to sleep, if they could. So let's wrap this up. And again, thank you all very much for coming to our wonderful evening lectures. And please look out for your email. Taiwan Institute Studies program at the University of Thomas will have more functions for you to attend. We will try to inform you and entertain you at the same time. So, thank you. Have a good night.